In this video, we're going to use Entity Framework to set up relationships between tables in a database. In the previous video for this series, we covered project setup and migrations. If you're not sure about those steps, then please watch that video first. I've also included the before and after source code used in this video in the description. So if you want to write the code as you watch, please download a copy of that. We'll get started with database relationships. The example project we're using is an API for a blogging platform. The platform has a table which we've already created for all the users of our blogging service. Each user of the service can have one blog, so we need to create a blog entity and set up a one-to-one relationship between the blog entity and the user entity. We'll first create a new class called blog.cs, and then we can start adding the properties. We'll have a blog ID, which Entity Framework will automatically recognize as the primary key of our table. Then we'll add two strings, one for the name of our blog and one for the description. And finally, we'll add a date time, which will be used to specify the date that the blog was created. We'll add our blog entity to the application DB context, which we created in our previous video. This is necessary to tell Entity Framework that this class is supposed to be a table in our database, and also we'll use this property to write queries against the blog table in our application. Now we can set up a one-to-one relationship between the blog entity and the user entity. The first step of that is to add the navigation properties. Navigation properties are used to tell Entity Framework that two entities have a relationship and are also used to access the related entity when writing code. An important consideration when adding navigation properties is whether to use the virtual keyword. The virtual keyword is used in lazy loading. For example, if you run a query from within your application to access a specific user, that query wouldn't automatically return the user's blog until you try to access it, at which point Entity Framework will query the database and load it in. If you don't use the virtual keyword, then all of an entity's relationships will be included in the first user query. You can improve performance a lot by using navigation properties and lazy loading correctly, and this is something we're going to look at in more detail in a later video. Please subscribe and watch out for that. Next, we need to add a reverse navigation property to the blog entity. Since each user has a relationship to one blog, each blog has a relationship to one user. This isn't always necessary, and Entity Framework can recognize the relationship with just one of the navigation properties, but it's good practice and also useful when writing queries. The final thing we need for a one-to-one relationship is to specify the foreign key as a property in the user entity or the blog entity. Which entity you put the foreign key in depends on your application and database structure. For example, if we add the foreign key int user ID to the blog entity, then we won't be able to create an entry in the blog table without providing the user ID. And the same would be true if we instead added a blog ID foreign key to the user entity. You could make the property nullable, and then Entity Framework will set up the foreign key in the database to allow nulls. This would be useful, for example, if we wanted to insert a blog entry into the database, but we don't yet know which user it will be associated with. However, in this example, I'm imagining that users will register for an account on the service and at a later time set up their blog, at which point we will have the user ID, so it won't be a problem. Now we can apply these changes to our database. We'll first add a migration, which will contain all of our changes, the new blog entity and the one-to-one relationship. Then run the update database command to apply the migration to the database. If we check in the SQL Server Object Explorer, we can see the new blog table was added, which contains a user ID foreign key. If we try to insert a row of data into the blog table, we'll get an error if we don't provide the user ID, since we didn't make the foreign key property nullable. Next, we'll set up the one-to-many relationship between the blog entity and the post entity, which we'll create first. Each post has a post ID primary key and two strings, one for the post name and one for the body of the post, which could contain markup or HTML for the actual content of the post. Again, we'll add the new entity to the DB context, and now we can start adding the navigation properties for the one-to-many relationship. Here we're using an I collection of the post entity, since each blog will have access to many posts. We'll then add the navigation property to the post entity, which has access to one blog. Setting up a one-to-many relationship is actually easier than the one-to-one relationship, since we don't need to provide the foreign key. With a one-to-many relationship, the foreign key is always in the many entity, in this case, the post entity. We could add a property for the foreign key to make this explicit if we want, but it isn't necessary. Then we'll add a new migration and apply it to the database so we can view the changes. If we check in the SQL Server Object Explorer, we can see a post table has been created with a foreign key blog ID that Entity Framework has created automatically. The last relationship we're going to configure is a many-to-many relationship. Let's imagine that we have a collection of images which can be shared between any blog on our service. So each image entity can be related to many blog entities, and each blog entity can be related to many images. We'll add a new class for the image entity with a primary key image ID and a string for the URL of the image. Since each image can have a relationship with many different blog entities, we'll use an iCollection of type blog for the navigation property. Since each blog can be related to many images, we'll use an iCollection of type image on the blog entity. Just like with the one-to-many relationship, we don't need to worry about the foreign keys, as Entity Framework will handle that for us. And finally, we'll add the images entity to the DB context, and then we can add the migration and run the update database command so we can check our changes in the database. If we look in the SQL Server Object Explorer, Entity Framework has automatically created a joining table for the many-to-many relationship, which allows a blog to be related to many images and one image to be related to many blogs. It has automatically decided on the table name and the field names for the foreign keys. If you would prefer to change any of those names, then you can always create an entity for the joining table yourself and use any table and foreign key names that you like. I'm going to end the video there. If you found it useful, please give the video a like. I'm going to be releasing more videos in this series, including performance tips and best practices for using Entity Framework in a production environment. So please subscribe to the channel and watch out for that. Thanks for watching.